The woods are not empty. They listen, they wait, and sometimes they take. From trails that vanish mid-step to campsites frozen in eerie silence, the national parks hold secrets that twist beneath the surface. Every shadow feels like it hides something watching, and every gust of wind whispers a name you'll never hear again. This isn't just nature, it's the edge of a nightmare. Tonight, Dread Scribe writes again. The first thing that struck me about Red Creek was the stillness. The air carried the damp musk of pine and earth, but it was unnaturally hushed, like the forest had swallowed its own voice. When I stepped into the clearing, I froze. Backpacks were arranged in a neat circle around the fire pit. Zippers pulled, shut, straps carefully folded. A half-burned log lay in the ring of stones, its charcoal edges whispering that flames had licked it recently. But there were no people, no footprints leading out. Only the impression of life pressed into objects, as if the hikers had simply evaporated mid-motion. It felt less like a campsite and more like a photograph missing its subjects. I crouched beside one of the packs. The nylon was damp but intact, the kind of dampness that suggested it hadn't been abandoned for long. I unzipped the top and found granola bars, neatly packed clothes, a flashlight with fresh batteries. Everything a hiker would cling to for survival was here, yet the owners were not. My breath caught. The weight of silence pressed against my ears until I could hear my own heartbeat. Forest silence is never complete. Usually there's a chirp, a buzz, a crack. But here, it was as though sound itself had been instructed to stand still. I remembered case files I had once read, accounts of hikers vanishing while food remained hot on their camp stoves, or boots left at the edge of rivers as if they had stepped into thin air. Search teams had combed these woods, dogs pulling frantic circles, but no trail ever picked up. Disappearance in stages, experts called it. Panic led to stripping off gear, to wandering off trails. But what I saw here wasn't chaos. It was order, it was intentional, and that made my skin prickle. I walked slowly around the clearing, eyes scanning for signs of struggle. Torn fabric, broken branches, drag marks. Nothing. The ground was soft with layers of pine needles, but no prints cut into them. It was like the forest had healed overnight, erasing whatever had happened here. The trees themselves stood like tall jurors, unmoving, their trunks lined with dark streaks of sap that glistened like wet eyes. Something in me refused to leave. The rational side of my brain whispered explanations. Perhaps they had left in unison, maybe frightened by an animal, or perhaps they had wandered to refill water. Yet, deep down, another part of me felt the scene had been staged for me to find, as if someone, or something, wanted the mystery preserved in perfect condition. I pushed deeper into the woods. The light shifted quickly, the kind of dimming where the canopy turns into a ceiling of green glass, cutting away the warmth of the sun. Each step sank into moss, releasing earthy scents, like old books opening after years sealed away. 100 yards from the camp, I saw it. A single shoe, wedged high into the crook of a tree, its laces dangling like a severed cord. I froze. The shoe wasn't weathered. Its rubber sole still carried the pale dust of trails. No hiker would, or could, have left it there. It looked placed, displayed, like an offering pinned against bark. My stomach tightened, and a chill ran over my shoulders as though unseen fingers traced my spine. If panic explained the missing gear, what explained? A shoe in a tree? The wind stirred, faint but deliberate, carrying with it the metallic scent of water from Red Creek nearby. The stream should have been comforting, but it felt like a lure, a whisper in liquid form. I thought of search theories again. Disorientation, exhaustion, hypothermia stripping people of reason. And yet standing beneath that shoe, I felt none of it fit. The puzzle pieces were cut differently here. I began retracing my steps, unease rooting deeper in my chest. And then it came, the sound that stopped me cold. A whistle, sharp and clear, floating through the trees. Not random, not a bird call. It had cadence, human cadence. 2 notes. Pause. 2 notes again. The same pattern rescuers use to signal one another. Except I knew there was no one else out there. The whistle came closer. Instinct told me to answer, but training insisted too. Notes meant, I hear you, not, I'm safe. I cupped my hands and returned the pattern anyway, breath slicing the cold. The reply drifted nearer, then paused, as if listening to my pulse. I moved toward it through ferns beaded with river sweat. Every leaf shivered. The clearing behind me felt like a stage after the actors had left. Props in the dark, waiting for an unseen director to whisper, action. I remembered my father teaching search patterns on summer hikes. Triangulate on sound, take bearings, never chase echoes. His compass rode my chest on a frayed lanyard, warm as a small animal. Sound bends in canyons, he'd say. What you hear isn't where it is. I tested that idea, turning until the whistle shifted, then moved sideways like a chess piece avoiding a trap. Still the cadence tracked me, exact. Whatever it wanted from me, I couldn't yet name. The creek appeared in shards between trunks, a moving vein. The whistle hopped upstream, always just beyond clean sight. I found an indentation in the moss, a heel print soft as a pressed thumb. Nearby, a strip of orange flagging tape fluttered from a sapling, then stilled, as if remembering a command. Relief lapped at me like timid water. People use tape, people leave prints. But what I didn't expect was the question woven into both. Who was guiding whom? At the bank, Red Creek ran clear, heavy, its surface twitching with tiny muscles. The abina whistle called from the opposite shore. I found no bridge. A fallen log offered itself, slick as obsidian. I tested it. The bark bled water. My father's rule hummed, never cross alone. But the camp's tidy absence tugged like a magnet. I stepped out, arms wide, a wire walker. Midway, color drained to graphite, then returned as if a cloud swallowed and released the sun. Briefly, the creek sounded hollow, like water poured into a metal throat. Infrasound, I thought, wind driving deep notes through trunks and ravines, frequencies that prickle nerves. Fear rose, cold and bright. The whistle answered, 2 notes blooming, inside my skull like a tuning fork on bone. I hurried the last steps, feet slick with algae. On the far bank, the forest breathed again, slow and tidal, as if relieved I'd made it across. Mud on that bank remembered everything. It held a riot of tracks, deer crescents, raccoon hands, the soft commas of birds, and boot prints. 2 sets, fresh. They walked toward a cedar grove and then simply stopped, as if the wearers had lifted away like lanterns loosed from strings. A nearby trunk carried faint crosshatch marks 5 feet high, not clawed but carved, coded like a forgotten map. I traced them. Sap wet my fingertip with a green peppered sting. I called my name into the grove like throwing a rope. The returning silence was a clock refusing to tick. I crinkled a thermal blanket. Sometimes noise summons eyes. Something shifted behind me, a branch releasing, or a choice. Between 2 cedars, a strip of yellow cloth glowed like a small sunrise. I approached and found a jacket folded with hospital precision on a low branch. A whistle rested on top, its red cord knotted. Then the 2-note call rose. From inside the folded cloth, right beneath the resting for me in his dimly lit cabin, a fire licking low against the grate, and his words carved into the silence like tools etching stone. He spoke of his colleague Daniel, who had vanished on what should have been the most ordinary patrol, just a 3-mile loop along a well-worn trail. The forest breathes differently out there, he told me, his eyes drifting toward the window as if the trees themselves could hear him. It exhales silence, thick, heavy. You feel it settle in your lungs. His hands trembled slightly, not from age but from memory, as if every detail was still alive under his skin. Daniel had radioed in halfway through the patrol, reporting fog rolling in from the valley floor. Fog was nothing unusual, but the way he described it made the hair on my arms rise. He said it moved like smoke from a hidden fire, curling low and thick, swallowing the trail behind him. His last words before the transmission cut off mid-sentence were, "It feels like the trees are..." Static consumed the rest. The silence afterward stretched for hours, then days. Search teams found no trace, not a boot print, not a scrap of clothing. Only an open trail, as though it had closed its mouth over him. I listened as the old ranger spoke, his voice heavy with guilt. We tell ourselves it was an accident, that maybe he got turned around, maybe an injury, but I've seen what the forest does when it wants to keep something. It holds on. His words carried the weight of someone who no longer trusted maps, someone who'd lived long enough to understand that not all boundaries were drawn in ink. What unsettled me wasn't just Daniel's disappearance, but the way the radio went, silent, mid-syllable, as if a hand had pressed against his mouth. It reminded me of studies I'd read on infrasound, low frequencies beneath human hearing that can cause dread, nausea, even hallucinations. Scientists believe it's why some people claim to see ghosts or feel watched in empty rooms. Could a wave of sound have been the invisible hand that interrupted his voice? Or was it something stranger, something the instruments can't yet measure? Curiosity drove me to hike out to Daniel's last known location. The forest greeted me with a dense hush, the kind of silence that rings louder than sound. Mist hugged, the ground curling around my boots, and every step felt like trespass. Pines loomed above, their trunks rising like cathedral columns into a canopy that swallowed the sky. The deeper I walked, the more the silence pressed, like the forest was listening to me instead of the other way around. I reached the marker where Daniel's radio last pinged. For a moment there was nothing but the pulse in my ears. Then I saw them, marks etched into the bark of a pine, high above my head. Long, deep grooves raked into the wood with a force that shredded bark into curled ribbons. Too high for any bear, too unnatural for weather. They climbed vertically, deliberate, almost ritualistic, like something had tried to ascend the tree by force. My throat dried. I traced the grooves with my eyes, wondering if Daniel had seen them before he vanished, wondering if something had seen him. The old ranger's words came back, whispering like a warning. The forest holds on. And in that moment, I couldn't help but ask myself, what if it wasn't the fog, or the sound, or confusion? What if it was the forest itself, deciding who gets to leave, and who never comes back? Standing beneath the scarred pine, I felt the air vibrate with a low hum, so faint I wondered if it was imagined. It threaded through my chest like the resonance of a struck bell. Infrasound, I thought. Natural frequencies the forest could produce when wind tunneled through ravines. But the sensation was different this time. It wasn't just vibration. It felt directional, intentional, as if the hum was guiding me, or worse, warning me. I steadied myself, recalling studies where test subjects exposed to infrasound reported overwhelming dread. Their bodies convinced a predator lurked nearby. What if Daniel had felt this? And what if the fear had driven him deeper, step by step, into places the map no longer claimed? The trail narrowed as I pressed forward, each bend offering only more silence. Even the birds refused to fill it. My mind began to measure the quiet-like distance. 1 second, 2, 3, each stretch making my heart pound harder. Then I noticed the ground. Pine needles flattened in an unusual arc, as though something large had swept through, brushing them aside. Not a paw, not boots, but a pattern like ribs pressing into earth. It reminded me of fossils, impressions of creatures long gone, except these were fresh, fragile, already fading. I thought of Daniel again, the way his voice had trailed off on the radio. Perhaps he had been describing this, marks that didn't belong, signs the forest had rewritten itself around him. The idea pressed down with a weight heavier than my pack. A part of me wanted to turn back, but another part, stubborn, reckless, needed to know what lay further on. Mystery is a dangerous fuel. It burns hotter than fear. Half a mile deeper, the fog thickened. It coiled upward, wrapping trees like gauze, muting their sharp lines until they resembled bones under translucent skin. My flashlight beam bent oddly, swallowed whole within 20 feet. I remembered the ranger's phrase, "The forest exhales silence." Now I understood. The fog wasn't just weather. It was architecture, a wall that rebuilt itself behind me. For the first time, I realized I was no longer sure which way I'd come. Panic stirred, sharp and metallic. I forced myself to breathe evenly, to anchor on facts. Compass north, stream to the left, visual markers. But then above me, another set of claw marks carved into a neighboring pine. Higher still, almost brushing the canopy. Whatever had made them hadn't just climbed, it had reached. The grooves were so far up they seemed impossible, like someone had dragged knives through the sky itself. My thoughts spiraled. What predator climbs like that? What hand? What paw? What force could etch lines higher than ladders could reach? The scientific part of me whispered improbable explanations, lightning strikes, warped growth. But my gut told me I was reading a language not meant for humans. The forest had left a message, tall and deliberate, coded like scripture against bark. I lifted my radio, more from ritual than reason, and pressed the call button. Static hissed back. Then, faintly, beneath the static, a voice bled through. A single syllable stretched and cut mid-breath, eerily familiar. It was Daniel's. And before I could answer, the forest swallowed the sound whole. The first time I heard about the girl in the yellow jacket, it came as a whisper from a search volunteer who had spent weeks scouring the ridgelines. His eyes had the glassy sheen of someone who had walked too many miles without finding an answer, but his voice sharpened when he described it. A bright yellow jacket folded neatly on a boulder in the middle of a trail, as though placed for someone to find. The girl herself was gone. No footprints, no struggle, no sign of where she'd gone. Only the jacket, waiting in silence. That image stuck with me. A jacket is supposed to be protection, against rain, against cold, against the elements. To leave it behind is to strip yourself of survival. Yet in every report, the jacket wasn't discarded in panic. It was folded, tucked like a gift or an offering. Over the following days, multiple hikers came forward with their own sightings. Yellow fabric appearing miles apart, always arranged with the same meticulous care. It reminded me of breadcrumbs in a fairy tale, except here the forest didn't seem to lead you out. It pulled you deeper in. I retraced one of those accounts myself. The trail twisted through dense pines, their resinous smell clinging to the air, and the ground was soft with fallen needles. When the sun cut through, it painted the path in golden stripes. I almost missed it at first. The jacket lay across a stump, folded square, the yellow so vibrant against the green that it seemed to glow. I approached slowly, half expecting someone to step out from the trees. But no one came. My hand hovered over the fabric. It was clean, almost too clean, as if the forest itself had conspired to protect it. The rational part of me searched for explanations. Cognitive science calls it pattern seeking. Our minds bend reality toward what we expect to see. Maybe hikers projected the jacket onto ordinary scraps of fabric or light through leaves. But that logic faltered against the detail. Witnesses described the brand logo stitched above the chest pocket, the missing button on the left cuff. They hadn't just seen yellow. They'd seen her jacket. Dozens of them, all describing the same thing with precision. Could they all be mistaken? Or was the forest recycling the image, placing it again and again as if to keep the story alive? The deeper I hiked, the more the sightings began to blur into ritual. Another hiker swore they saw the jacket laid across a tree branch, perfectly balanced. A ranger mentioned finding it by the riverbank, folded beside a flat stone like an altar. Each version echoed the last, but in different corners of the park. It was as though the jacket had a life of its own, moving silently between landscapes, leaving behind its luminous trail. I reached the edge of a cliff near dusk. The air tinged with the mineral smell of stone and the distant hiss of wind through canyons. And there, high above the drop, shreds of yellow fabric fluttered from branches that jutted over empty space. They swayed like flags, signaling from a place no one could reach. My chest tightened as I stared upward. Had she climbed that far, desperate and clinging? Or had something else placed her there, pinned against the stared back sky like a wall of unanswered questions, each scrap of yellow fabric trembling against the wind? They were impossibly high, snagged on branches that stretched out into empty air. No ordinary climb could explain their placement. To reach them, she would have needed wings, or something unseen would have needed to lift her. I stepped closer to the edge, the ground shifting beneath my boots, and peered down into the canyon below. A void yawned back at me, a river far beneath, its silver thread barely audible against the hush of stone. I thought of the witnesses again, those scattered testimonies of the jacket appearing and reappearing across the park. What if the sightings weren't independent accounts, but echoes like a song replayed in different places? Memory itself can fracture under pressure, reshaping what we see. Psychologists describe it as confabulation, the brain stitching false details into true ones. But there was something sharper here, something deliberate. Dozens of hikers couldn't have all imagined the same missing button, the same folded neatness, the same impossible glow in the woods. The precision gnawed at me, like a thread too tightly wound to dismiss. I leaned against a pine near the cliff, its bark rough and grooved beneath my palms. My own reflection of fear echoed the accounts I'd heard. The girl spotted once near a trailhead, another time by the creek, each version overlapping but never aligning. It reminded me of the way light refracts in a prism, one beam splitting into many, each shard of color real, yet none the full truth. Was the jacket simply light refracted by grief, multiplied until the forest itself seemed to shimmer with her absence? Or had the place absorbed her story and begun to project it outward, like a film caught in a loop? A sudden gust rattled the trees, scattering needles across the cliff's edge. My eyes locked again on the fabric high above. It looked less like torn cloth and more like banners, signals stitched into the sky. And beneath them, the branches bowed downward, twisted unnaturally, as though something heavy had pressed against them. My pulse surged. If she had fallen, why wasn't there evidence below? Shoes, scraps, bones. The canyon floor held only the quiet flow of water, untouched, indifferent. The absence was louder than any scream. I remembered a line from a searcher's journal scrawled in pencil. The jacket shows us where she isn't, not where she is. That thought followed me now, heavy as stone. Perhaps the sightings weren't clues at all, but warnings, breadcrumbs leading not to escape but into the heart of vanishing itself. My breath felt shallow, as if the forest had leaned closer to listen. I turned from the edge, unsettled, the vision of yellow still burning behind my eyes. And as I stepped back onto the trail, a flicker of color flashed in the corner of my vision. There, just ahead, another patch of yellow lay folded in the dirt, waiting. Not torn, not weathered. Fresh, as though placed only moments before. It began with a storm that came too fast. Sheets of rain had swallowed the horizon before the campers could even gather their bearings. According to them, lightning split the sky in veins of white, and the forest floor became a soup of mud and shadows. But in the chaos of thunder, they saw something that shouldn't have been there, a cabin glowing warmly in the trees. They described the glow as golden, almost buttery, a stark defiance against the night. Inside, they claimed, was safety, a cedar smell thick as incense, the gentle hiss of a kettle on the boil, and a rocking chair that never seemed to stop moving, as if welcoming them in with a rhythm older than the storm. They huddled there until morning. When the storm cleared, they swore the cabin dissolved like smoke. Where walls and windows had been, only ferns stretched toward the new sun. And when they told rangers, they were met with shrugs. No structure had ever existed in that part of the park. No old maps marked foundations, no blueprints hinted at forgotten shelters. It was as if they had sought refuge in memory itself. Skeptics lean on psychology. In survival situations, the brain invents comfort, a mirage of safety shaped by primal need. Hypnagogic hallucinations, some call them, where exhaustion and fear sculpt visions so real you could touch the grain of the wood. But even hallucinations don't explain the consistency of detail. Each camper described the same cabin, the cedar, the kettle, the rocking chair. 3 people sharing one dream at the same time stretches coincidence into something else. I carried their story with me into the forest, determined to follow the breadcrumbs they couldn't. The air grew thick the deeper I went, humidity clinging to my skin until it felt like a second body. My boots sank into loam that smelled of iron and rain. The forest seemed to fold over itself, trails doubling back, paths tapering into nothing. And yet, I felt pulled forward by an unseen string, the way a tide can guide driftwood without letting it know. By dusk, the woods had grown restless. Branches creaked like bones shifting in their sockets, and mist curled low, licking at the underbrush. My flashlight beam cut narrow tunnels into the dark, each revealing more of the same: ferns, trunks, silence. I was ready to turn back when my foot struck something too solid, too deliberate. I swept the light downward and froze. Stones, large and rectangular, arranged in a perfect outline. A foundation. They were not scattered, not tumbled by accident. They formed a clean rectangle, corners squared as if sketched by hand. Moss hugged their edges, but the lines remained true, geometry surviving where wood had rotted away. It was like stumbling on the ghost of architecture, a blueprint carved into earth. My pulse quickened. The campers had seen walls and windows, but here lay only the skeleton, the forest's memory of what once was. The air thickened with the scent of cedar, sudden and inexplicable, curling into my lungs like smoke from a fire that no longer burned. And somewhere in the silence, I swore I heard it. The faint rhythmic creak of a rocking chair, moving when no wind stirred. The sound was faint at first, almost indistinguishable from the groan of trees in the wind. But as I stood at the edge of the stone rectangle, it clarified, a slow, deliberate creak, the kind a wooden rocker makes as it tilts forward and back. My breath tightened. There was no chair, no porch, no walls, and yet the rhythm persisted, like a heartbeat echoing from an invisible body. I closed my eyes and felt it in my chest, an oscillation that seemed to synchronize with my pulse. The forest was carrying the memory of movement, even after the object itself had vanished. I crouched beside the stones, brushing moss with my fingertips. The texture was damp and cold, but beneath it I felt grooves, marks etched into the rock, deliberate and deep. They resembled notches, as though once used to anchor beams or posts. It dawned on me that these weren't just stones. This had been a foundation, an intentional footprint of human presence. But whose? No records traced a cabin here, no homesteader, no ranger's post. It was as though the forest had tried to erase the evidence but failed to scrub the bones. The air shifted. A breeze threaded through the trees, carrying with it a scent so strong it snapped me upright. Cedar, fresh and sharp, as though someone had split logs nearby. My rational mind scrambled to explain it. Trees can release resin when cracked. Storm damage can mimic fresh cuts, but none were present. Instead, the smell hung thick, anchored to a place where no cedar stood. It was like perfume lingering after the wearer had gone. And with it, a whisper of warmth touched my cheek, fleeting, almost tender, as if the cabin were still trying to welcome me inside. I thought of the campers again, drenched and terrified, stumbling into a glow where none should have been. Perhaps their minds had woven comfort, a hallucination stitched from desperation. Yet the foundation under my boots proved something else had existed. Memory, whether human or environmental, seemed to hold on to fragments. Psychologists argue that the brain replays trauma in protective loops, constructing false shelters. But what if the land does the same? What if the forest remembers its structures long after they've crumbled, projecting them like afterimages to those who need them most? The creaking grew louder, steady as a pendulum. I swung my flashlight across the stones, half expecting the shape of a chair to emerge. Nothing, only empty space vibrating with suggestion. Then, at the far corner of the foundation, I noticed a cluster of small objects, rusted nails bent and weathered, arranged in no order. I picked one up. It was warm, unnaturally so, as though it had been lying near fire. My hand trembled. Heat doesn't cling to metal for decades, not like this, unless the fire hadn't truly gone out. The forest pressed in around me, shadows swelling between the trunks. The rocking sound slowed, each creak spaced wider, as though something were rising from the chair. My chest hollowed with dread. If the cabin had been real once, who had built it? And more chilling, what had stayed behind after the walls were gone? The final creak lingered, suspended in the night air, and then silence collapsed over the stones. That was when I felt it. The distinct impression of eyes watching from inside a room that no longer unsettles you. The kind where silence becomes too heavy, like glass stretched across the earth. Locals called it the lake that swallowed time, and as I stood on its edge, I understood why. Its surface reflected the night sky with such precision that it felt as though I were looking into another world, one where constellations lived twice, above me in stars and below me in water. It was more mirror than liquid, a sheet of darkness holding galaxies on its skin. Yet the stories weren't about beauty. They were about absence, people who went in and never came out. I had spoken to a fisherman in town earlier that day. His voice was low, his words careful, as though saying them too loud might wake something. He told me of a cousin who had been swimming there as a teenager, laughing one moment, gone the next. No thrashing, no bubbles, no sound, just a vanishing. Act in daylight. It doesn't give them back, he said, staring at the floor. Not even their shadows. I carried his words with me as I pitched my tent near the shoreline, the air thick with pine and the faint mineral scent of the water. Science offers an explanation. Limnologists describe how cold shock can paralyze muscles in seconds, how deep underwater caves can trap bodies forever. In some lakes, currents twist unpredictably, creating pockets that drag victims beneath. These facts are real, tangible. But what troubled me was how seamlessly they coexisted with folklore. The villagers believed the lake wasn't just water, it was a threshold, a door that doesn't open both ways. Their phrase lingered with me like a riddle left unsolved. The night grew colder, and I sat by the shore, watching the stars double themselves in its surface. The stillness was oppressive, pressing against my chest the way silence does in a room where something important has just been said. I thought of Einstein's theory of relativity, how time bends under gravity, how black holes stretch it until seconds become years. What if, I wondered, this lake was not just swallowing bodies, but minutes, hours, entire lifetimes? It felt less like water and more like a clock wound too tightly, waiting to break. At some point, my fire dimmed to embers, and the woods behind me faded into a blur of shadow. The lake held all my attention. I tried tossing a pebble in, a simple test, just to hear sound break the silence. It struck the surface and vanished without so much as a plink. No ripple spread outward, no disturbance at all. It was as though the lake had swallowed not only the pebble but the very memory of its descent. My breath caught. Even the most placid water should respond, but this was refusal. I pulled my jacket tighter, unease crawling up my spine. Just before dawn, when the horizon began to blush pale gray, I noticed something. Ripples. Not many, just a few circles widening across the glassy surface. No wind stirred the trees. No fish broke the surface. They spread outward from nowhere, concentric rings dissolving into the lake's impossible calm. It looked like time itself had dropped a stone. And if water remembers, what else lies suspended beneath its silence? The ripples grew, faint but steady, expanding into the lake until they reached the shore at my feet. I waited for the cause, a fish, a branch, some logical disruption, but nothing surfaced. The water smoothed itself again, swallowing its own evidence, until it was once more a mirror holding the newborn light of dawn. My skin prickled. The fisherman's words echoed back. It doesn't give them back. What unsettled me wasn't just the disappearance of people, but the way the lake erased the act of vanishing itself. No bubbles, no sound, no struggle. Only silence stitched seamlessly back together. I leaned closer, peering at the water as the rising sun revealed its true clarity. Beneath the surface, there were no darting fish, no drifting leaves, only a depthless blue that seemed more sky than water. My reflection stared back at me with unnatural sharpness, the kind of clarity you never see in rippled glass. For a moment, it wasn't me I was looking at. It was someone else, or something else, mirroring my movements, but delayed, as if caught a fraction of a second behind. I jerked back, heart hammering, the image dissolving like smoke. I tried to ground myself. In science, cold stratification layers the water in summer. Sudden mixing can create optical illusions, but none of that explained the delay. It felt instead like I had glimpsed a memory stitched into the water. My face replayed not as it was now, but as it had been an instant before. Could the lake hold not just bodies, but moments? Could it suspend slivers of time like insects in amber? The thought sat in my chest like a weight, both terrifying and irresistible. I walked the perimeter, hoping distance might break the spell. The forest leaned inward, its branches forming arches over the shore, framing the lake as if it were a stage. In one bend, I found a wooden cross, weathered and tilting, its base eaten by moss. The letters carved into it had faded into illegibility, but the gesture spoke louder than words. Someone had marked this place with grief, and I wondered, was this where the cousin had vanished, or someone before him? Or someone after? The timeline seemed to dissolve, each story bleeding into the next, like ripples merging until no single origin remained. By midday, fatigue pulled at my eyelids. I sat on a rock, letting the lapping water numb my boots. That was when I heard it. A faint splash, though the surface remained smooth. My pulse quickened. Then another splash, louder this time, followed by silence so absolute it rang in my ears. I turned my gaze across the expanse, and that was when I saw them. Out on the water, far from shore, a cluster of circles appeared, ripples blooming without source. In their center, something dark floated, just long enough to register. The curve of a hand, pale and reaching upward, fingers stiff against the light. Then it vanished, leaving only widening rings that dissolved into the glass once more. The lake's surface sealed itself as though nothing had happened, but the image burned in me, refusing to fade. If water remembers, then somewhere beneath that flawless mirror, a hand is still reaching, suspended in a silence the world above will never hear. The ranger station smelled faintly of dust and pine, sap, a time capsule preserved in filing cabinets. I had been leafing through old maps, thick paper yellowed at the edges, ink trails winding through valleys and ridges. That was when I noticed it. A faint line, almost an afterthought, cutting across the northern slope. It was drawn as clearly as any other path, labeled with a name I didn't recognize. Yet when I compared it to modern charts, the trail was gone, erased, as though the land had swallowed it. I asked one of the older rangers about it. He stared at the paper too long, his lips pressed tight. Finally, he said only, "That trail hasn't existed in years. Some say it never did." His vagueness made me lean closer. Trails don't vanish, they fade, they grow over, but they leave scars in the earth. But this one, according to him, there was nothing left to find. It had been wiped clean, erased, with a precision that didn't match the way forests usually reclaim. What unsettled me more was a story he reluctantly shared. A hiker years ago had claimed to walk that very trail. He returned only once, frantic, shaking, his voice jagged, with disbelief. He showed photos, images of paths cutting through trees, then narrowing into nothing, ending in a wall of green. Another photo showed a trailhead that led to nowhere, a ribbon of dirt dissolving into moss. Days later, he disappeared while trying to retrace his steps. Search teams combed the forest but found no sign. Only his camera remained, abandoned on a rock. Neurologists might call it topographical disorientation. The brain misreads landmarks, invents paths where none exist, convinces the traveler they're still following logic when in truth they're circling themselves into exhaustion. But the photographs made that explanation brittle. They weren't hallucinations. The camera had seen what his eyes had, and now, staring at the faint line on the map, I felt drawn to it, as though the paper itself were a door whispering open. I set out at dawn, the forest dripping with dew, birds carving sound, into the silence. At first, nothing unusual marked the way. Then I noticed the trees. They bent in subtle arcs, all leaning inward toward an invisible spine of earth. It was as though the forest itself was bowing, acknowledging some presence that had once passed through. My boots pressed into soft soil, and faintly, very faintly, there was the impression of a path. Not carved, not deliberate, suggested, like a scar barely healed. The deeper I walked, the stranger the alignment became. The trunks leaned not randomly but rhythmically, as if choreographed by unseen hands. Light filtered through the canopy in stripes, each band falling across the ground in perfect symmetry. I felt less like I was walking a trail, and more like the trail was walking me, pulling me forward with quiet insistence. Eventually, the faint scar ended in a clearing no larger than a room. At its center stood a stone. Waist high, its surface weathered, but its edges sharp. My flashlight beam caught the carving, letters etched clean into the face. "Don't come back." The words looked raw, freshly cut, as though someone had been here hours before. And yet, when I brushed my hand across the grooves, dust clung to my skin like ash from a century. Its warning carved deep enough to cut more than rock. My fingertips traced the grooves, feeling the uneven edges where the chisel had bitten. And yet the dust that smeared across my skin told a different story. Old. Ancient. The paradox sat heavy in my chest. Fresh lines, ancient residue. It was as if time had stuttered here, refusing to commit to one version of truth. I stepped back, staring at the words, and felt the forest tighten around me, every tree suddenly listening. I crouched low, studying the soil at the base of the stone. No footprints, no signs of a recent visitor, not even the scuffle of an animal. It was undisturbed, like a stage prepared but never performed upon. My mind clawed for rational ground. Perhaps the words had been recut over years, renewed by some unseen hand, keeping the warning sharp. But renewed for whom? The trail was missing from every modern map, scrubbed from official records, denied by rangers themselves. Warnings are meant to be read. Who was meant to find this one, if not me? The wind shifted, carrying the scent of damp leaves and something sharper, metallic, almost like rust. I turned, and for a fleeting moment, the clearing seemed smaller, the trees leaning closer than before. It was like standing in a throat, the forest preparing to swallow me whole. I remembered the vanished hiker, his camera showing paths that began and ended without logic, as though the land itself were rearranging beneath his feet. Looking at the bent trees surrounding me now, I wondered if I was standing in the same place he had reached, staring at the same stone, reading the same command he had ignored. I pulled my compass from my pocket, desperate for bearings, but the needle quivered strangely, spinning as though drunk. My chest tightened. Magnetic anomalies weren't unheard of in these mountains, but the timing felt intentional, a hand knocking the compass loose just as I needed it most. I tucked it away, forcing calm into my breath. North or south no longer mattered. What mattered was choosing to obey the words before me, or to test them. Against my better judgment, I stepped past the stone. The soil gave beneath my boots like soft bread, sinking deeper than it should. My flashlight cut into the space beyond, and for a moment I saw a continuation of the trail, faint but visible, curling away into darkness. I froze. This was impossible. The scar had ended here, yet now it extended again, beckoning forward like a ribbon unspooling. I lifted my camera, snapping a photo, hoping to anchor the moment in proof. The flash lit the trunks in stark white, and in that burst I swore I saw movement between the trees. Not an animal, not wind. The arc of a shadow, human-shaped, slipping out of sight just as quickly as the light died. My pulse roared. I blinked into the dark, seeing nothing but absence. The stone loomed behind me, the carved words now a commandment in my skull. Don't come back. But the trail ahead waited, reshaped as if time itself had drawn it freshly for me. And the question pressed, harder than fear itself. What happens if I follow where the erased map still leads? I first heard about him through a ranger's weary voice, the kind that carries more disbelief than relief. A man had been declared missing after failing to return from a weekend hike. His car sat abandoned at the trailhead. His pack list suggested he carried little food, and the weather had turned against him. Cold rain, sudden winds, the kind of conditions that strip the forest down to its bones. Search parties swept the ridges for days, their shouts swallowed by the trees. Then, without warning, he stumbled. Out of the woods, barefoot, ragged, but very much alive. When I met him weeks later, he sat hunched on his sister's porch, skin pale, eyes sunken but restless. He looked less like a survivor and more like someone still halfway lost. He told me he remembered walking with rescuers, not strangers, but familiar faces, each wearing bright jackets that glowed in the fog. They led him along trails, shared canteens, of water, spoke his name as though coaxing him forward. But when I compared his account to the ranger logs, no such groups had ever reached him. Search teams had combed different slopes entirely. The ones he swore had saved him didn't exist. His memories tangled further. He described sleeping in a canvas tent he hadn't packed, the smell of kerosene lanterns burning, the sound of voices humming just outside, too soft to decipher. Yet when he woke, there were no tents, no lanterns, only forest floor damp with dew. He insisted he had eaten meals, cans of stew he hadn't carried, bread warm as though fresh from an oven. His sister's hands tightened around her tea as he spoke, eyes flicking toward me as though to ask if I believed him or if he was drifting into madness. Psychology offers an answer: dissociation, hallucinations born of exhaustion and hunger. In survival literature, the brain often splits itself to protect from trauma, creating companions or illusions to carry the body forward. But then he showed me his watch. It was digital, scratched, but functional. When he left, it ticked normally. When he returned, the time had jumped forward by 3 full days, unrecorded, as though the mechanism itself had been swallowed by the same void that took his memories. His mother's voice trembled as she recounted those missing days. We prayed for him, but it felt like we were praying to someone who had already gone. Relief mixed with suspicion in her eyes. Gratitude that he was home, dread at the possibility he might vanish again. Her words clung to me, sharp as glass. Families usually speak of second chances with joy. Here, the joy was shadowed, fragile, like a candle flickering in a draft. I pressed him once more about the rescuers he swore had guided him. He leaned forward, eyes hollow but burning with conviction. They knew my name before I told them. They knew where I'd been. They knew where I was supposed to go. His voice faltered, and when I looked back, they weren't there anymore. The woods had returned him once. But what haunted me most was the unspoken question written across his family's faces. What if the woods decide to take him back? The question gnawed at me as I followed him back into the rhythm of his daily life. On the surface, he moved like any other man. Grocery runs, coffee sipped from chipped mugs, polite nods to neighbors. But every so often I caught him pausing mid-step, head tilted as if listening for something only he could hear. His family noticed too. His sister whispered that he still woke in the night, calling out names none of them recognized. He would insist he had walked with those people, shared firelight with them, trusted them. Yet the names left no trace, not in town records, not in any list of volunteers. They were companions that existed nowhere but in the fog of his lost days. Asked if he'd be willing to show me where he had gone missing. He agreed with a hesitation that spoke louder than words. We drove to the trailhead where his car had once sat like an empty shell. The forest greeted us with its quiet authority. Pines stretching skyward, their tops blurring into gray. The trail beneath our boots was ordinary at first. Mud packed by hikers, roots weaving like knotted veins. But the deeper we went, the more his pace faltered. He looked around as though trying to align two realities, the remembered one and the visible one, neither quite fitting. At one bend, he stopped cold. "Here," he whispered, voice thin as thread. "They met me here." I scanned the space. Nothing unusual, just a break in the trees where light filtered down like pale curtains. But his eyes glazed, and he described lanterns glowing amber in the mist. Voices welcoming him forward, a hand steadying his shoulder. The air was still, but I felt it too. That subtle sense of arrangement, as though the forest had been set like a stage waiting for actors who had simply failed to appear. Neurologists I consulted later would remind me of how fragile memory becomes. Under stress, how easily the brain stitches new scenes onto the canvas of survival. But even science had no answer for his watch, which I examined myself. The digital face still bore the gap. 3 days gone, not advanced by accident, not drained of battery. Simply missing. It ticked forward now as though nothing had happened. Its silence about those lost hours louder than any testimony. As the sun began to dip, we turned back toward the trailhead. His gait slowed further, and at one point he clutched my arm. "Do you hear it?" he asked. I strained, catching only the normal forest chorus, the distant tap of a woodpecker, wind-stirring needles. But his face paled and he shook his head, as though hearing something I couldn't. "They're calling again," he said softly, his eyes scanning the spaces between trees. By the time we reached the car, his hands were trembling. His mother met us at the porch that night, her relief sharp, immediate, but I noticed the way her embrace lingered, as though she were anchoring him, afraid he might slip away even here, in her arms. The thought wouldn't leave me. The woods had let him walk out twice. The trail began. How many chances does a place? A ribbon of dirt winding between pines that swayed gently in the breeze. The forest was awake but hushed, birds weaving thin threads of sound above me, branches groaning like old bones. My own footsteps felt steady, the crunch of gravel beneath my boots a simple rhythm. But then I noticed it, an echo that wasn't an echo. Each step I took was matched, perfectly synchronized, as though someone walked beside me, shadowing my stride. The cadence was too precise to dismiss as chance. At first I told myself it was the terrain. In narrow valleys, sound can ricochet, bouncing back delayed and reshaped. Acoustics carve illusions. But as I listened more carefully, Unease tightened around my chest. The steps weren't behind me, they were with me, layered so neatly with my own that the forest itself seemed to be doubling me. The effect was uncanny, like watching your reflection move before you do. And then, just as suddenly as it began, the footsteps stopped. Mine continued. The silence that followed wasn't natural. It was surgical, as though someone had sliced the forest in half and removed its voice. I froze mid-trail. The world held its breath. Even the wind seemed to hesitate, caught in the branches, afraid to disturb what had just happened. Slowly I tested it. I shifted my weight forward, letting one boot fall. Crunch. No reply. The mimic was gone. Yet the absence felt heavier than the sound itself, a void pressing against my ears until I could hear my own blood rushing. Fear works like a lens, bending everything into focus. At that moment, the forest no longer felt vast. It felt claustrophobic, as though invisible walls had closed in around me. I needed to break the tension. I lifted my hands and clapped once, sharp and deliberate. The sound cracked like a gunshot through the stillness. For a moment, nothing. Then, another clap, faint but clear, drifting back through the trees. It came half a second late. Not the bounce of an echo, not the soft smear of sound reflecting off stone. It was delayed, deliberate, as though something had waited before answering. My arms prickled with goose flesh. Physics insists on explanations. Sound shadows exist, zones where waves bend and stretch, where echoes appear to come from nowhere. But this didn't feel like distortion. It felt like conversation. The forest had repeated me, not by accident, but by choice. I clapped again. Another reply, always half a beat behind, like a child trying to mimic an adult's rhythm but leaving just enough pause to show it wasn't real. A chill licked my spine. I scanned the trees, every trunk a dark sentinel, every branch heavy with silence. I wanted to call out, to force the unseen mimic to reveal itself, but some instinct locked my throat. Instead, I stood, listening to the absence, aware that silence itself had become an active presence. If sound could be remembered, replayed, then what was holding the memory here? The trail stretched ahead, a narrow artery into the deeper woods. And I realized with a shiver that whatever was echoing me might not be done listening. I walked on, each step deliberate, testing the ground as though it might betray me. My ears strained for the phantom rhythm, half expecting it to return. At first there was nothing but the fragile crunch of my own boots, but then, faint and uncertain, I heard it again. 2 steps, perfectly in time with mine, before breaking off into silence. It felt less like being followed and more like being studied, as if the forest were rehearsing me, learning my cadence piece by piece. I stopped abruptly, hoping to catch whatever was out there in its mistake. The woods answered with nothing. The quiet deepened, a quiet so heavy it seemed to smother even the possibility of sound. Silence became tactile, pressing against my skin like static. I rubbed my palms together just to hear something familiar. But the rasp was swallowed, muted before it could fully form. It was like speaking in a dream where your mouth opens but no words escape. To prove to myself I wasn't unraveling, I clapped again, louder this time. The reply came, half a second late. Then another faint clap after that, weaker, as though multiple versions of my sound had staggered into being. My breath hitched. This wasn't mere reflection, it was multiplication. Sound splitting like cells, each version slightly less alive than the one before. If sound had a memory here, then maybe it had a ghost too. I thought about auditory science, about how our ears evolved to catch the faintest predator movement. Our brains can fill gaps, inventing noises to explain unease. But what chilled me was the precision. Evolution doesn't invent half-second delays or repeating echoes. That was choreography, intention stitched into acoustics. I wondered then, not for the first time, if the forest itself was the instrument, and I was nothing more than its test note. I pressed deeper into the trees, each bend of the trail marked by unease. At one point, I stumbled over a root, and the sound of my fall cracked out like a branch breaking. Moments later, it cracked again. Same sound, same pitch, replayed just beyond my sight. I spun, scanning trunks blackened with shadow. Nothing. My chest tightened as though invisible hands were pressing down, testing the fragility of bone. The trail widened briefly into a clearing. Here the silence was absolute, a dome that erased every trace of the outside world. My heartbeat thundered against my ribs, the only noise left. I forced myself to break it. Another clap, desperate, reckless. The reply was instant this time, not delayed, as though whatever mimicked me had finally caught up. The sound came from directly ahead, clear, sharp, impossible to deny. I lifted my flashlight, beam trembling as it cut through the clearing. Branches glistened with dew. Mist crawled low across the ground. Then, just beyond the circle of light, another clap burst out, louder, closer, undeniably human. My arms stiffened, frozen in place. If sound had memory here, then something was playing it. Back not as an echo, but as an answer. The first time I heard about it, the ranger's voice carried that brittle edge people get when they're trying not to believe what they've already seen. He described stumbling across bones, dozens of them, scattered in the middle of a restricted zone. Not the random carnage left by predators, not the aftermath of decay. They had been arranged, each one deliberately placed in a spiral that tightened toward the center like a whirlpool carved into earth. It was too precise, too intentional. The forest doesn't deal in geometry like that. Humans do, or something that wants to imitate them. Curiosity gnawed at me, the kind of itch that feels dangerous to scratch. I set out before dawn, hiking through fog so thick it folded the world into gray sheets. My boots sank into moss that squelched with each step, releasing a damp, iron tang. The deeper I went, the more the woods seemed to resist me. Trails grew faint, branches snatched at my clothes, and the silence thickened until even the birds held their tongues. It felt like entering a cathedral abandoned by God, but still fiercely guarded by its walls. When I finally reached the clearing, the air shifted. It was colder there, unnaturally so, as though the spiral itself exhaled frost. I stood at its edge, staring down at the arrangement. Bones bleached white against the black soil, ribs and femurs and skull fragments aligned with mathematical care. The spiral curved inward with unnerving precision, each piece forming part of an unbroken chain. It reminded me of a clock without hands, ticking silently toward a center that promised no answers. I crouched low, examining the fragments. They weren't ancient relics, worn smooth by time. Some still clung to tatters of sinew, dark and shrunken, as if death hadn't long passed. I felt the weight of that discovery in my stomach. Anthropologists argue that early humans often arranged bones in ritual patterns, symbols of worship or sacrifice. But these remains had been carbon dated, I later learned, and some were disturbingly recent. A deer skull barely a year old, the jaw of a coyote only months cold. This wasn't history frozen in time. It was something ongoing. A sound cut through my thoughts, a raven's call, harsh and guttural, slicing the silence overhead. I tilted my head back to see it circling the clearing, wings black against the pale sky, its cries carrying the weight of an omen. Ravens have long been tethered to myths of death, scavengers drawn to endings. But this one didn't descend. It simply orbited as though keeping watch over the spiral below. I stepped closer, tracing the spiral's path inward with my eyes. And that was when I saw it. Near the center, the arrangement faltered. A space had been left empty, wide enough to fit a single body. Larger than the deer bones, larger than the coyotes. The gap was intentional, the way a puzzle leaves room for its final piece. My chest tightened. The spiral wasn't finished. The raven screamed again, circling lower now, its shadow stretching across the void. And for the first time, I realized the space wasn't just waiting. It was the edge of that spiral, the empty space yawning back at me like an invitation or a demand. The bones seemed to lean toward it, as if every rib, every femur, every shard of skull was pointing to the absence at their heart. My breathing grew shallow, and I felt suddenly like an intruder at a table already set. My presence noticed, accounted for. The raven's caws beat down from above, each one sounding less like a warning and more like a countdown. I forced myself to move, stepping carefully between the bleached fragments. The crunch of soil beneath my boots felt deafening, a violation of the silence the bones seemed to guard. At the center, the air was thicker, carrying a coppery tang that reminded me of rust or blood. I crouched low, scanning the space. Soil there wasn't untouched. It bore faint indentations, shallow depressions, as though something heavy had once been laid there, then taken away. My stomach tightened at the thought. Perhaps the spiral had been complete before, and someone had removed the final piece. Or worse, maybe the spiral was still waiting to claim it. I brushed dirt away from one bone near the gap. It wasn't weathered smooth like the others. Tiny grooves marked its surface, shallow but deliberate. Carvings, not random scratches from predators or roots, symbols. They looked almost like letters, though no language I could place. Coded like a forgotten map, each line etched with intention. Whoever arranged these bones hadn't simply wanted order, they wanted meaning. Anthropologists might call it ritual behavior, echoes of cultic practices where bones marked thresholds between the living and the dead. But the freshness of these remains gnawed at me. This wasn't the echo of some ancient rite. This was rehearsal, continuation. The spiral wasn't a monument. It was a work in progress. The raven dropped lower, its wings slicing the air just above my head, its shadow blotting the light. Its caw cracked the silence, and the bones seemed to shiver in response, as if sound itself could animate them. My chest tightened. I clapped a hand over my mouth, terrified of making noise, of contributing another vibration that might feed whatever rhythm was unfolding here. That was when I noticed the spiral extended farther than I'd first thought. Smaller bones, rodents, birds, rabbits, spiraled outward from the larger ones like satellites orbiting planets. And beyond them, etched faintly in the soil, more circles waited, outlines prepared but unfilled. The pattern wasn't ending. It was expanding. Slowly, relentlessly, it was growing outward, ring by ring, toward the tree line where I stood. I stumbled back, heart pounding, but the raven didn't flee. It landed at the edge of the empty space, talons gripping soil, eyes fixed on me. Its head tilted once, sharp and decisive, as though measuring. I realized with a jolt that the gap wasn't just the absence of bones. It was the outline of a body, human, my size. The spiral wasn't unfinished. It was unfinished without me. And in that moment, I couldn't tell if I had discovered the pattern or if I had simply stepped into it. It begins not with what I see, but with what I feel. The air changes, not colder or hotter, just heavier, as though it carries weight I can't measure. My skin prickles, and a strange certainty settles in, the certainty of being watched. It's a sensation so primal it bypasses logic, born of the same survival instincts that warned our ancestors of predators crouching in the brush. Neuroscientists call it agency detection bias, the brain's tendency to invent an observer even in emptiness. But out here, standing in a clearing where 9 people once vanished, it doesn't feel invented. It feels intentional. The clearing is ordinary, at first glance. Tall grass sways, a ring of pines guard the edges, and the soil beneath my boots is soft, damp with yesterday's rain. Yet every missing persons report notes this place, each testimony hinting at the same eerie weight, the sense of eyes. Some claimed it pressed against their backs. Others felt it creep along the edges of their vision, just beyond where light could reach. None of them lasted long here. Their voices dissolved into silence, their paths swallowed without trace. Tilt my head back, scanning the canopy. The branches tangle like black veins against the sky. Shadows ripple across them, too synchronized to be random. It looks less like wind and more like the trees are leaning in, conferring with one another. My rational mind rebels. Trees don't watch, shadows don't listen, but instinct tells another story. Instinct insists I am not alone. I walk to the center, heart hammering, and stop where the grass flattens into a natural circle. The soil is bare here, as if something heavy has pressed it down again and again. I kneel, running my palm over the ground. It's colder, strangely so, as if the earth itself remembers what has been taken. The impression lingers like the after-image of a flame burned into the eye. Science tries to soothe me. Our minds are wired to notice patterns, to sense agency where none exists. It's an evolutionary trick. Better to imagine eyes that aren't there than to miss the predator waiting in silence. But what if the trick isn't in my brain? What if it belongs to the forest? What if it has learned to mimic that feeling, to press it against us until we obey its awareness? I stand, spine stiff, and glance around. The shadows shift again, aligning with strange precision, like chess pieces sliding into formation. For a moment they gather into shape. Vague, human, impossibly tall, its silhouette framed by the trees. My throat tightens and I blink hard, expecting it to dissolve. It doesn't. It lingers, still as a statue, waiting. My breath clouds in the air, though the night isn't cold enough for it. I step backward, forcing my gaze to break. The circle seems to hold me, tugging me toward its center like gravity. Every instinct tells me to leave, to escape the gaze that is no longer just imagined. But the forest doesn't follow. It waits, and that patience feels more dangerous than pursuit. I turned away from the silhouette, each step a battle against the instinct to glance back. The clearing pressed at me like a weight on my shoulders, its silence deeper than the woods I'd walked through to reach it. Even the birds avoided this place, leaving only the sound of my breath and the fragile crack of twigs underfoot. When I reached the edge of the circle, the trees loomed closer, their trunks dark and watchful, like guards unwilling to let me pass. I paused, my hand brushing against bark. The surface was rough, scarred with lines that at first looked natural, but the longer I stared, the less random they seemed. Patterns emerged, scratches almost geometric, crossing at angles like coded letters. I remembered the stories, missing hikers who swore they saw shapes in the trees, marks no one else could find. My rational side whispered pareidolia, the brain's hunger to make sense of chaos, but my gut clenched with something simpler, sharper. These weren't accidents, they were messages, carved by time or by something using time as its chisel. Behind me, the clearing breathed, not in gusts of wind, not in rustling leaves, but in subtle shifts. Grass bending, shadows elongating, a rhythm slow and deliberate. The forest wasn't chasing, it was inhaling. I thought again of the missing 9, their names etched into Ranger. Reports with no bodies recovered. What if they hadn't walked away? What if they had simply been absorbed, inhaled into the breath of something that didn't need to move to capture? I forced myself onward, deeper into the tree line. But even there, the sensation clung. Every rustle sounded like intention, every shift of shadow like an eye adjusting its focus. Neuroscientists explain this feeling as misfired circuitry, but explanations crumble when the phenomenon refuses to fade. This wasn't my mind inventing eyes in the dark. This was the dark inventing eyes inside me, making me complicit in its gaze. The trail narrowed, and for a moment I thought I'd shaken it. Then I glanced back. The shadows at the edge of the clearing had shifted again, stretched into a single form too tall to belong to any man. Its outline was unmistakable now, shoulders squared, head tilted slightly, as though listening. My pulse thundered and every muscle screamed to run. Yet the figure didn't follow. It simply held its place, patient, unblinking, as though it had already claimed me by standing still. I turned once more, pushing through brush, the forest closing behind me like a door. Relief flickered when I saw the faint line of trail ahead, a thread of safety winding back toward the known world. But even then I felt it, the lingering pull of eyes that never needed to chase. Some stories don't end. They wait, suspended, in the silence of places like this. And as I left the clearing behind, I realized with a chill certainty, the forest doesn't need to find you twice. Once it has seen you, it never forgets. Subscribe, if you dare.